Hi, Nico. This is Ira, and I'm recording here some feedback on your statement of belief. I know you've already written and rewritten and worked on and finalized your defining good argument in digital context essay, so I'm not expecting you to go back through and do anything more with that. If you don't, that's perfectly reasonable. Truly. Still, I do want to make sure that you have the chance to, if you'd like it. So if you do want to make revisions to that after listening to my feedback on the statement of belief, feel free to do so and to send the major essay, resend that by Sunday. But again, this is genuinely, I'm recording this to share with you responses to the statement of belief that I hope will be interesting and useful regardless of whether you decide to go back and do any further revisions. You don't have to, and you won't be penalized or yada, yada, yada. You know what I'm saying? The point is, I just want to make sure that you also get feedback, that you don't lose out on feedback just because you finished the major essay in a totally timely, reasonable fashion. All right, so basically what I'm going to do is go back and reread this statement of belief and highlight some things that I think where you made a particularly fine point, and also highlight some places where I want to challenge you or urge you to think more systematically in some way. And to be clear, obviously this is not really an evaluation of a statement of belief. There's a good version of what it is, and it was interesting to read and actually makes me really look forward to reading your major essay. And, I think there's some places here. It'll be interesting to see whether you work those out in the major essay. But there's some places here where I think some of the tensions in this statement of belief can get better systematized or worked through more fully. And so this feedback is hopefully helpful to you in your life in general, just as you're thinking through this stuff, in an ongoing way. And then maybe also useful if you decide to make any final kind of small edits or whatever in your major essay. Okay, so you sort of define argument in general as a collection of self-prescribed and pre-incorporated beliefs, assumptions, facts, opinions, and ideological notions culminating in verbal deliberation with another's beliefs, etc., which may hinder and or cause discomfort in the form of opposition to one's self-disposed motions. That's quite a definition, but it's interesting. I mean, I buy that as a definition, so that the thing that really highlights is that argument always has the possibility for the arguer of some kind of internal change. In other words, the arguer, in this way of defining argument that you have, argument fundamentally incorporates the possibility of the arguer herself or himself changing their mind in some way. You then further define what's happening in the argument, which serves as the persuasive mechanism to inject one's portion of reality probably into another, which is it's an interesting way of thinking about what argument is. And one of the things that I'd be interested to hear more about is how revolving around empirical data and the complete understanding of the subject matter make all this good. What is it that makes those behaviors a good version of this? If what's at stake in argument is trying to inject one another with our portions of reality, but also at the same time being ourselves capable and somehow of changing our mind or in the way of changing our mind. If that's what's at stake in argument, why do empirical data and complete understanding comprise the primary components of good argument? At the same time, I also want to challenge you a little bit, because when you talk about complete understanding of the subject matter at hand, I mean, that's a very high bar. And I wonder how often do any of us attain, and rise above that particular bar? And I would suggest almost never. I remember when I was doing my PhD, one of the first things I noticed, I was doing some research in the library on some topic, I don't even remember what anymore, for a class, and I had this intense realization that I would never read enough of the work on that particular area to even know which of the work that I hadn't read I should read. In other words, complete understanding is probably impossible in a very full sense. So then the question becomes, so what is good enough understanding? For this way of thinking about good argument, what amount of understanding is good enough? What constitutes complete enough understanding? And how is that related to empirical data? You say that a good argument cannot be solely based upon emotion or feelings, but may add context and understanding for those on the other side. And so how are context and understanding related to empirical data as you understand it? I'm not sure what you mean by the word here, flounder, like what the word is doing here. But the rest of this, I'm with you. I'm just kind of wanting to hear more about what's the relationship between empirical data as you understand it and adding context and understanding. What constitutes empirical data? What makes data empirical and, again, good enough? So I'm kind of, what I'm interested in here and what I'm trying to get at is what is your way of defining the bar for good enough understanding, good enough empiricity of data, and why? Why do you draw that line where you do? When you're talking about good argument, you're talking about this as understanding all of our own sort of intrinsic equality. I love this. It's an idea that's what's at stake is a kind of attitude. And you talk about bad argument as relying heavily on emotion and on logical fallacies. This is a great line. It reserves fact to be nothing but opinion, and opinion to be the true norm. That's a great line. It's compelling. And yet, aren't many facts at the very least contingent and partial? And so the kind of coming back to that previous question, how do you draw the line? How do you determine when an assertion, a statement is good enough to count as fact and when it's not? And what do you do with the instances where, so-called logical fallacies are actually really useful? You talk here when you say arguing with a Nazi is impossible, their entire rhetoric revolves around them being better than you and I. Obviously, I could totally agree. But at the same time, that is an argument ad hominem. In other words, that's an argument that comes from the person. It's the Nazis' Nazi-ness that makes them not somebody we can argue with. Fair enough, I think that's correct. But that's an argument ad hominem, which we usually think of as a fallacy. So I just want to encourage you to be a little careful when thinking about fallacies or so-called fallacies. But anyway, so another great line, a shouting match toward an immovable object. I like the way that you're thinking about what happens when we try to argue where there's not a possibility of persuasion. And that highlights something that's not really as clear here, but that the possibility of persuasion is something that we also can refuse in some way. And so one of the things I'm interested in is, what about the situations where two or more people are arguing, but their argument is also a performance for others? So, obviously that includes, for instance, political debates. But it also sometimes includes, say, an argument on Facebook where two people are genuinely unwilling to have their mind changed, but each of them wants to display and perform their arguments for some other people, for some third party or some other 20 people reading the exchange. And some of those people are willing to have their minds changed. Can that be good argument? Can those kinds of performances be good argument? And if so, how does that trouble this way of thinking about the impossibility of arguing with people who are inaccessible to? About the impossibility of good argument with people who are inaccessible to persuasion. So, in other words, if arguments that are kind of more of a performance can be good, does that change the notion that this makes argument intrinsically bad? Sorry, that was said fairly confusingly. Let me have another go at that. If it's possible to perform an argument with somebody who is completely inaccessible to persuasion in such a way that both parties are hoping to persuade some other audience, i.e. not one another, or not all five of them, however many people are involved. They're not trying to persuade each other exactly. They're trying to persuade some other audience. Can that be good? And if it can be good, how does that trouble the definition? And if it can't be good, why not? Why is that necessarily bad? And that kind of comes down to this question here about what's at stake in the communication and removal of opinion. We try not to let emotions sway our opinions, but we also don't want to completely remove emotions because that would be impossible and would cause other issues. So we want to try and limit anger, annoyance, frustration, etc. And here I want to say, what about cases where the emotion itself is a reason? So let's say a person wants to, your partner that you're seeing wants to persuade you to go play in the snow with them. And the reason they want you to do that, you don't feel like doing it, but the reason they want you to do it is because they're feeling sad and they want to do something that will make them feel better. Their emotion, their sadness itself, if you can't feel their sadness, you're going to find that very unpersuasive, right? I mean, you might find it logically interesting, but not super compelling. But if you feel with them their sadness, if they communicate their sadness itself is an important part of the persuasive appeal. And probably something, if you're a good partner, that you're able to hear and attune to and want to do something with. So I want to kind of challenge you on the idea that emotion should just be limited to the smallest possible part of argument. And I want to encourage you to think, well, what about the cases where the emotion itself is precisely what we're asking one another to feel and attune to and be present to? In those instances, emotion would seem like it's probably a good, something that contributes to a good argument, an important thing. And if so, then once more, how does that kind of impact the definition? I already talked about fallacies and what you count as empirical and understanding. I really enjoyed reading this. And I like the way that you're thinking about how no matter where argument's happening, it's trying in some way to change our mind. One of the things I was looking for more here is a really clear sense, in the statement of belief, but something I will be looking for in reading the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay, is a really, really clear sense of, in these different spaces, especially obviously in digital contexts, what is it that defines good argument, and why is that thing good? Since, after all, lots of things can change our minds that are not logical, that rely on really bad fallacies, that are manipulative uses of emotion. Since all of those things certainly can change our minds, and thus are successful arguments, why are they bad? What makes them bad? And what does their badness consist? And what makes them, their converse, good? So this is really a question about what are your reasons for the things that you value, that you think are particularly good? All right. So anyways, that's all kind of the things that I thought as I was reading your statement of belief. And Whether you choose to do more work on the defining good argument in digital context essay or not, that's totally up to you. I haven't read it yet, so this is really just a response to this statement. But either way, I hope that these comments may be of use to you or of interest to you, just in general. I really appreciated reading this, and I'm looking forward to reading the major essay. Thanks.